Hi, this is Dan Bullard, sitting out here in the river, retired electronics engineer. I'm going to talk to you about some of my attitudes, okay? Some of you say, man, he must be bitter or something. I don't know what it is. Well, let me tell you a couple stories, okay? When I went from Genrad to Credence, I picked up a digital tester there. The class was taught by my friend of mine from Genrad, who had moved over to Credence before me, and he was testing this. He was teaching this tester, digital tester, using a 1024-bit shift register. And so, in his pattern, and I was pretty good at digital by then. In his pattern, he had these loops of 1023 because he needed to pump ones and zeros through this 1024-bit shift register to get something to come out. So you put in a 1, go 1023 times, and then out comes the bit, right? Well, turns out he was a little bit mistaken about how his thing worked, because I tried, he taught with this program for years. He taught this program for years. And once I picked up the program, or the course and then the program, I started doing some experimentation, and I found that the clock edge was at, like, let's say 200 nanoseconds. 200 nanoseconds is the clock edge, okay? If you strobed after 200 nanoseconds, the test would fail, okay? Now, you would think that, if you're clocking data into a register, you clock the register, and then one cycle later the data will come out. Well, he was clocking it in, and the data was coming out all right, but it was the opposite data, because 1024, whatever the number was he was using, was the wrong number. He was one cycle off, just one cycle off his whole career on this device. So if you strobed too close to the clock and strobed after the clock, it would fail, meaning that you were actually one cycle off. So I loved it. It was great. I kept running into that stuff all the time, and I won't tell you like who, but some of the like Motorola, great. They were fantastic. Some of the companies that I worked at were fantastic. They really had their crap together. But some didn't know the first thing about electronics. And I won't mention names, but for example, a military contractor, okay? Military defense contractor. So, don't worry, they only make nuclear missiles and jet fighters and things that can kill people. But it's okay. So, this one product that this defense contractor was working on, they had a CMRR test, common mode rejection ratio. And so what they were doing was they were putting a signal into an op-amp kind of thing, an amplifier, and getting out the signal. And then they were putting the signal into both inputs and getting out a very small signal. And they wanted to compare the two. Well, that's a tough test to do in any example, but it really helps if you do it the right way. So what they were doing was they were putting in like a 10 kilohertz wave, 10 kilohertz sine wave, and on just one input with the other input grounded, and they got the signal out, and they measured it, not with an FFT, they measured it by taking a bunch of samples and then averaging, or not averaging, but averaging the waveform overall, and then looking for the peak. And so they go through and search the wave for the peak, and so then they can say, okay, there's the peak, so the peak times 0.707. Oh God. You think about that, okay? The peak times 0.707, what does that assume? That assumes that you got a sine wave going through there. It doesn't say anything about, well, maybe you're clipping, maybe you got harmonics. It doesn't do any of that. No rejection of noise at all. In fact, they had to take 4 million samples and then average them to get a single cycle and then look for the peak. And even then they had to throw away some of the larger numbers because it was throwing their numbers off, their measurements off. 4 million samples. Now it's okay because it's a defensive product, so test time doesn't matter, right? In production for consumer goods, production time is everything, so you want to get the test time down as low as possible. But for defense things, it doesn't matter, right? And they didn't care. So they were taking 4 million samples. Let me say it again, 4 million samples. And they were still getting really dicey numbers with CPK. The CPK, that is how much the result varied from one measurement to another, varied quite a bit. It was too much. But they got, with 4 million samples, they were able to get it down. I realized this is a really bad way to go. So I went in, they did this on a Teradyne A585, I think. And that tester has the ability to do an FFT. So I did it. I took the program, changed it over to just do an FFT. 8192 samples. Boom. Dropped the test time by 10 seconds. Now, the test time for my TV tuner for Maxim was like 10 seconds. So basically, the test time for an entire consumer device would take 10 seconds, but this defense contractor was wasting 10 seconds taking the average of 4 million samples when I did it in 8192 samples and got a better result, better CPK. Why? Because the FFT automatically sends the noise out to where it belongs and any harmonics, and the peak is easy to find in bin M. So, I mean, this defense contractor, they didn't know the first thing about FFTs. In fact, let me tell you something. This was 20 years after I learned how to do an FFT. And I don't even have a degree. 20 years after I learned how to do an FFT, they were still not using FFTs. They were still doing things like averaging and looking at peak and multiplying by 0.707 to get the RMS. It's terrible, terrible, terrible. So, you know, I don't have a lot of respect for a lot of people with degrees. I'm sorry if that's, you know, if you have a degree and if that bothers you. But it's because I've seen this stuff. I mean, I've seen ridiculous stuff. I worked at a lot of different places. I worked at Motorola, Intel, Westinghouse, TSMC, well, not TSMC, but Siliconware, which was right next to TSMC, Samsung. I mean, I've worked all over the place. I've worked for all these companies, and I've seen good and I've seen bad, and I've seen really bad. I knew a guy who interviewed me. After I got laid off, we had lunch, and I was talking about Distortion, my book, and I was talking about FFTs, and he said, an FFT is just a button on a scope. Or was it, he said, an FFT is just an approximation, right? That was another guy that said FFT is just a button on a scope. So this is the way they look at things, right? An FFT is a godsend. It's one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century. And it's like, you know, Fourier figured out in 18 whatever it was. So, you know, the FFT is a fantastic thing. Why don't these engineers see it? Why don't they understand it? Why don't they use it? You shouldn't have a degree if you can't figure out an FFT. And, you know, it's really easy. I mean, it's really, if you know how an FFT works, you know right away, it's dead easy, right? You take an FFT of, say, 5 cycles, the fundamental shows up in bin 5. Gee, how hard is that? So, why these people can't understand this is beyond me. So, anyway, that's why I have such disregard for people with degrees, because I've seen so many of them that are so stupid. Anyway, that's enough whining for now. This is Dan Bullard from the river. See you later.